and welcome to a new episode with Astrid, your APD, the dietitian with T, no C. And today I am speaking with someone very special. She's Michelle May, and we went through lots of different things on mindful eating and why it is important to love what we eat and eat what we love. So this is going to be a very fruitful talk, and make sure you stay until the end. And if you have any questions, please write them down in the comments. Let us know what was your favorite part of the video. See you on the other side.
It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it.
Let's have a chat about what you do, all these books that you have written specifically about a non-diet or a way neutral approach when it comes to healing your relationship with food and a mindful eating approach.
Yeah, so I am a physician. I was trained as a family physician in the US. And unfortunately, many physicians don't have nearly the education in nutrition that we really need compared to how often this topic comes up. So if we're smart, we're referring to dietitians to be part of the team and guide our patients. But I got interested in it because I personally had been struggling with yo-yo dieting since I was a teenager. And of course, for many years, like many of my patients, I didn't know that there was another way. I didn't even realize there was something going on there. I just thought there was something wrong with me. Like I wasn't able to follow the rules. I didn't have enough willpower. I didn't have the right diet, and that kind of messaging that really led me into what I now call the eat, repent, repeat cycle, which is often driven by guilt and shame and an attempt to change my body size. So when I finally realized that dieting was a big part of the issue driving my disordered eating, I developed a program along with a psychologist and a dietitian and an exercise physiologist to help my patients really develop a much more comprehensive approach to their eating. Now, initially, of course, I've been doing this for nearly 22 years now. And initially, I brought my own weight bias with me. And initially, I called it a non-diet approach to weight management. And I still see a lot of that out there in the media now that people are finally starting to understand that diets don't work. I think people are now trying to say, okay, well, we're not dieting. But as I was, really learning and growing and working with thousands and thousands of people, I realized that as long as there was any focus on changing one's body size or body weight, by definition, there would be restrictive eating. And so people would get stuck with wanting to stop dieting, knowing it that wasn't helping them. But as long as they were measuring the success of that by the change on the scale, they weren't able to make the progress they were really capable of. So, Am I Hungry? My company is very clearly now in the non diet, mindfulness based, weight neutral camp. We do not promote weight loss. Now, that's not to say that some people don't lose weight. Some people might, but that's not my business. That's your body's business. It's not even really your business, right? Like your weight isn't a behavior, so it's not subject to behavioral modification. What we need to focus on as health and wellness professionals is how to help people make decisions about their eating and their movement and their self-care that are sustainable, as I've heard you talk about many times on your podcast. It's so important that people create a program. I don't even want to call it a program because it's not a program anymore once it's truly integrated into your daily life. So, long answer to a short but important question, which is why non-diet and why weight neutral, which I think is really important. And there's a lot more depth to that, depending on whether you want to go down the science route or whether we just want to go down the practicalities of it. But the truth is, you and I both know that diets and a focus on weight loss really doesn't make a change long term anyway.
No, I agree. I think it is really, as a practitioner and maybe as a dietitian, in my experience, there is an ingrained culture that you need to look certain way, that your purpose is to lose weight. If you're not losing weight, you're failing on your life. And this is potentially most common in women. I see that also in men. Recently, I've been having more male clients, which is very surprisingly, because I specialize in working with women, but more men have come to me and say, look, I am struggling with binge eating. I am struggling with body image. And this is very interesting to see, because there is always a battle with your body image nowadays. And in the fitness, I think in the fitness industry it's worse, because there is that ideal body image. You have to look certain way. If you're not ripped and shredded, you're not part of that culture or that environment. And it seems to be a little bit more, it puts more pressure on you, you have to look certain way. Actually, I am working with a company. They are like fitness physiques and coaches. And I was talking with one of my friends, that another coach that works there, and I asked her, do you think I need to compete in bodybuilding? Do you think I need to look certain way because I want to fit in? Like, I had that in my head, in the back of my head, like, I need to fit in better. How can I fit in better? And then I stopped myself and said, look, you are more than what you look. And if you're a good professional, you know what you do, that's even more worth it, especially because you care. You pay attention to everything that is going on with your clients. So your services are not going to change because you look differently. And like, I'm not saying I'm just different, but it's just like this, always this thought of needing to fit in and needing to change your body shape, and even if you're not in a bad shape, quote unquote bad shape, but you always want to look like the others to fit in that
Yeah,
culture.
so Astrid, you are really hitting on, I think, a very important conversation here, which is that the bodies, as a physician, I know I've seen a lot of people naked over the course of my career. And I can tell you that the vast majority of people do not look like athletes or bodybuilders. And that people in bodies follow a bell-shaped curve, that there are people at both ends of the spectrum who are naturally slim and naturally much larger, and maybe some who train to the point where they have the ideal physique that you're referring to. But most of us are somewhere in here. Now, people, of course, when they live in a body that's stigmatized by our culture, when they live in a body that they don't see in the movies or on magazines or on Instagram, then it's easy for them to think they need to change their body in order to be worthy and acceptable and beautiful and healthy and successful. I think our job is to say, yeah, I get it. I totally understand why you would feel this way. And all bodies can be healthy. All bodies are beautiful. And the different bodies that we have, the diverse bodies that we have in our culture, are part of what makes culture beautiful. It's not about pursuing that. And so I'm not saying that we tell people don't want to lose weight, but I think we have to really recognize that it's coming from outside pressure. And because it's so rarely successful long term, we just need to support our patients and clients to really doing what does work, which is starting to change our relationship with food so that we can truly create space to live that big, vibrant life we crave, the life that we are promised if we lose weight, but yet rarely ever happens. It's possible for everybody, no matter what their size.
Yeah, two things that I just picked up on you that you mentioned. One of those is like, do you really think, like, I really wanted to ask you this. When you think about diets don't work, really, how do you measure the success of a diet? Because diets work depending on what you are looking for and how you implement it, and depending on what the goal is. Like, if you really want to, like, if the goal is to change behavior, diet is not putting on the diet someone on a diet is not necessarily going to change that behavior unless you work on habits and behaviors and modify patterns in your nutrition, and not necessarily blaming specific foods or telling someone that this is good or this is bad, but changing the mindset and the approach, how you see food, maybe is different. But when we think about diets don't work, what is the ultimate goal of a diet? if we think about what's the purpose, because it is also, like you mentioned, people are going with a wrong intention when they want to lose weight. It's because it's not something that is self-driven, or it's not sometimes because they think perhaps they need it because their knees are pain, they have knee pain or back pain, or perhaps the excessive body fat might be affecting their quality of life, which is reasonable if you want to tackle from a medical and scientific point of view that weight loss might be a helpful solution if something is perhaps damaging your quality of life or affecting the way you live because it's something physical that is hurting you. Maybe it is worth it to talk about perhaps weight loss sometimes if you have
Well,
the
yeah.
right
So
intentions.
yeah, so I 100% get your question. So let's go back to diets don't work. Well, if we're just talking about weight loss,
Yeah,
temporary weight loss, of course they work. Weight loss is not hard, right? Like that is for many people up to a certain age and a certain number of years of weight cycling and a certain, medical conditions and other things. Weight loss isn't really the most challenging piece. When
keeping
I
it off.
say diets don't work, I mean, they don't work long term. I've never met anybody that said, I'd like to lose weight for about a month, or I'd like to lose weight for a year, or I'd like to lose weight for a couple of years. The vast majority of people, when they say, I want to go on a diet to lose weight, they are thinking that this is going to be a permanent change. The research is really clear about this.
Yeah,
Diets do not work to create long-term change. They don't. I mean,
yeah,
and if you can show me a diet that creates long-term change, and I mean long-term, let's see some 5-year out studies. Let's see some 10-year out studies. If you can show me one that creates long-term changes in weight, then in the vast majority of people, and that actually keep track of the people who drop out, because as well as I do that the dropout rates are huge. So even when you look at studies that say, well, 20% of people lost X amount of weight and kept it off for 6 months, they're saying 20% of the people who are still in the study, and they don't mention that 50% of the people dropped out the first couple of months. I mean, I think as health and wellness professionals, we need to start actually reading the literature. Stop reading the headlines, stop reading the abstracts, and go and read the actual study. There's an example. Lucy Aphramore and Lindo Bacon wrote a paper about the nutrition articles that were published in a European nutrition in a dietetics journal. And they actually analyzed the statements that were being made in the abstracts with what the research actually said. And I won't get the exact example right, but it's in the article, and I'd be happy to send you a link so you can include it in your show notes if you'd like. But one of the examples was in the abstract, it said a low calorie appeared to have increased the success of a weight loss program when added to behavioral modification. When they actually went and read the study, though, it turned out that it led to 0.07 kilograms lost more than the other group. And for most people, 0.07 kilograms is not a meaningful difference, and they wouldn't say that that was success. So my invitation to all of you listening, whether you're a health and wellness professional or you personally have seen yourself going up and down and up and down and up and down, is to say, you know what? You're not broken. You're not messed up. You don't lack willpower. It's just that restrictive eating, which is I use a broader term than dieting, because nowadays restrictive eating can take the form of eating healthy or avoiding carbs or intermittent fasting, not for the purposes of weight loss, but to be healthier. I mean, there's lots of forms of restrictive eating. If you have noticed these patterns in yourself, it's important to recognize that restrictive eating for many people actually triggers feelings of deprivation and cravings and eventual giving in and overeating and even binging and guilt and back to restrictive eating again. And so it becomes this vicious eat, repent, repeat cycle that is really depleting on our energy and causes us to feel bad about ourselves. And because when it doesn't work, we go back to the diet or the restriction again, and we get back in the cycle again. So a lot of people get stuck thinking that they're just never going to find the answer. What I've discovered, and it sounds like you also understand, is that if we can stop the restriction, move away, all foods can fit into a balanced diet, and start really freeing up our energy from weighing, measuring, counting, and logging food, looking things up and writing things down, and really start using our energy to live that life that we want, all of a sudden food starts to lose a lot of its power that it holds over us when we've been restricting for so long.
I agree. I think it is so important to look at that empowerment and give yourself that unconditional permission to have access to everything, that nothing is off limit. And once you do that, actually, the food loses so much power in you, as you said. Like you're no longer thinking about food every single time because it is no longer, it is there. Like, it is available, it is not restricted. So that need to connect and have it desperately is no longer there because it's just there. Like I always associate this example with like when the pandemic started, that everyone was buying toilet paper because it was running out, and it was that desperate need to buy something they didn't even need, but because it was that idea that it was going to be scarce and it was off limits to some point, people were just buying unnecessarily amounts that were completely useless.
It's such a great analogy. I love that, Astrid. That's a perfect analogy for what
Exactly.
happens when you trust that there's enough food that you'll be able to eat when you're hungry, that certain foods aren't going to be off limits or forbidden, or that you aren't going to have to pay for them with more exercise. Then it's like, oh yeah, I feel like eating that. Yeah, I'm not in the mood for that. Oh, that was really good, but I don't need a third serving because I'll just feel uncomfortable afterward. I can eat it again when I want it again. Why overeat it now? Why buy, an extra 12 rolls of toilet paper that I don't actually need?
Exactly. So I thought about that spectacular example because it's really what it is with food. And I do a lot of work with clients that struggle with binge eating. I don't think it's necessarily a binge eating disorder as such. So I actually wanted to talk to you about whether BED or BED is the same as when we talk about or refer to binge eating, because maybe there are slight differences between these two when we just refer to perhaps it's every now and then just because of the restriction, or is something that is is that severe, is that frequent, that is actually a huge disorder. So would you be able to explain a little bit about the difference, whether is it any difference when we use
Sure,
these terms?
there is. Yeah, there is. So binge eating may not have an exact definition. I would think of it in terms of eating more than somebody in a similar situation would eat. So we use the word binge watching all the time, binge drinking. And so you can think of it in similar terms, that it's really simply more or excess over and above what you would ordinarily do. So a binge eating episode is an episode. It becomes binge eating disorder. There's actually in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the most recent update, there's an actual definition and criteria that you have to meet. But to your point, it's binge eating that's occurring at least a few times, on a regular basis. Like it's happening very consistently and it's disrupting the quality of somebody's life. So you can actually look up the criteria. I can again send you a link with the actual criteria if people want to check it for themselves. But it's meeting certain criteria, eating faster than normal, eating more than normal, eating a lot of food when you're not even hungry. And a lot of people after a binge feel incredibly shameful and just absolutely horrible about themselves. And that's different from simple overeating. I mean, out of control or compulsive eating is closer to what we're talking about when we're talking about binge eating than overeating. They're on a spectrum, right? Like we might have, oh, I overate at a holiday or a sporting event, to all the way of, overeating. Maybe there's some emotional eating, maybe there's some binge eating, and then binge eating disorder on the other end of the spectrum. People with binge eating disorder often have an extreme amount of shame and guilt and self-loathing after an episode. They often will use binge eating as an attempt to try to manage some unmet needs, or maybe some very uncomfortable thoughts about their body, thoughts about their life, thoughts about themselves. And so the binge eating becomes a way of actually managing those uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, and a way of escaping from those. Now, the interesting thing that it's important for you to know is that binge eating is often associated with restrictive eating. Like,
Yeah.
there's this idea that people who binge eat are totally out of control. That's not been my experience at all. In our mindful eating for binge eating retreats, I hear people that know more about nutrition and have tried more diets, more controlled eating in their lives than most physicians or even dietitians. So it's not that they don't know better. It's just that restriction is another trigger for binge eating. And for
Yeah.
many people, it is one of the drivers for binge eating, in addition to those unmet needs and those uncomfortable thoughts. So I think the point here is that true binge eating disorder is an eating disorder. It should be treated by a therapist who's been trained in eating disorders. I am not a therapist. I know a lot about this because I worked with a therapist to develop our mindful eating for binge eating program, and to write the book, Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat, for binge eating. So I've had the great fortune to learn so much about it and work with so many people who struggle with it. The good news is that it is totally treatable, that it really responds to a mindfulness-based, non-diet, non-weight focused approach. Can I tell you a little bit about the research that we did to help you understand what we're talking about
Of
here?
course.
So there's something called the binge eating scale. And again, I'll provide the link to you that people can take. The binge eating scale isn't used by therapists to diagnose binge eating, but it's a great screening tool for your clients and for yourself to use if you suspect that somebody has binge eating.
Okay.
So we did a study on our Mindful Eating for Binge Eating program. We had everybody take the binge eating scale. And to be admitted, if they had severe binge eating, meaning that their scale, I think, was over 38, their score was over 38, they came into our 10-week program. That program consisted of mindful eating workshops and group therapy sessions once a week. It turns out that by the end of the 10 weeks, everybody was in a non-binging area. They had completely dropped off the binge eating scale into a non-binging level. Now, here's what's interesting about it. When we looked at them a year later, and this research is being analyzed and hopefully will be published soon, but when we looked at them a year later, the vast majority of people were still non-binging. The subset of people who had gone back to binge eating, most of them had also gone back to dieting. So restriction is a very powerful driver of the binge eating cycle. And I think it's really hard for people to wrap their brains around that, but I think it's super important for health and wellness professionals to understand that if your client has binge eating disorder, restrictive dieting is contraindicated. It will make their binge eating worse, or at least continue or perpetuate it.
I agree completely with that. And especially when we try to understand the reasons why a lot of people binge eat, maybe is that, as you said, it could be an emotional discomfort, it could be stress, it could be perhaps trauma, or like unmet needs that you haven't been able to find their way. What is your experience in terms of who is at higher risk experiencing a binge eating disorder? As we talk about it, who could be at higher risk when we think about an spectrum?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, since that's not my area of research. So I can't really say that. I will say that many people who start, well, first of all, let's talk about binge eating disorder in general.
Okay.
It's the largest population of eating disorders, like 3%. And that's as much as all the other eating disorders combined. So binge eating disorder is exceedingly common. It's seen often in men, unlike other eating disorders, which are less common in men. In binge eating disorder, many men have it. And that kind of speaks to what you were talking about earlier about some of the clients you're working with now. Many people who have binge eating disorder will actually describe having started binge eating even as a child. Like there was something way back then that happened. Not always, of course, but it certainly comes up a lot. And so it could be that a child who lacks the skills and support to deal with stressful situations in their life, they're obviously not binge drinking, but they might have access to food. And so food might become a way that they self-soothe or comfort themselves or take care of themselves. So beyond that, I would ask somebody who's more of an expert at that than I am. And I would only add what I already said, which is that restrictive dieting is a risk factor for all of the eating disorders. That drive for thinness that's so common in our culture that you were referring to earlier, it's a very common theme in every one of the eating disorders, including binge eating, even though that might seem counterintuitive. Let me say one more thing. You can't tell whether somebody has binge eating disorder by their weight.
Yeah.
Thin people can have binge eating disorder,
Oh,
and
yeah.
large bodied people may not have binge eating disorder. So I know you as a clinician know that, but there's a lot of people who make assumptions about binge eating and body size that really aren't true. When we run a mindful eating for binge eating retreat, often at least a third, if not 40% or more of the people who come probably would never come to the attention of their physician or dietitian. Nobody would say, "Hey, do you have binge?" Because their body size fits with that bell curve that we've all kind of thought, oh, well, that can't be an eating disorder.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I wanted to touch base on the difference between what emotional eating is and how we differentiate that with binge eating, because a lot of people tend to confuse these two terms together because they are relying on an emotion. They were stressed, there's something was behind, and they use food as a coping mechanism. And sometimes emotional eating is fine, is something that should be normal and accepted. But I think that it becomes negative when negative emotions are associated with it. So guilt, loss of control, feeling powerless on with food, and feeling like you want to compensate because you ate way too much and you feel that shame about it. But sometimes, like, I think emotional eating is such a broad term. Like when we think about it, we emotionally eat when we're celebrating something, when we going for our birthday or we just graduated. We eat because there's something important to celebrate with our family, with someone. So emotional eating has a really positive connotation to it, but it's also that combination of negativity when it goes to the other side of that spectrum and we completely lose the control and we eat because there's something on our hearts that are pressing to use food as that soothing, that coping mechanism to get away from our feelings. So would you be able to explain a little bit about that difference between emotional and binge eating?
Well, I 100% agree with you. So it's really important to understand that emotional eating is part of normal eating. We are comforted from the moment we're born when a caregiver holds us and feeds us. We celebrate birthdays and graduations, and we bring people food when they've lost a loved one or when they're sad or when we want to tell them we love them. And so emotions are part of eating, and that is normal and healthy and expected. And to your example, if we're using food to escape our emotions or manage all of our emotions, and we're not learning how to interpret emotions and understand what our needs are, that's when it becomes a problem. So again, there's nothing wrong with you if you emotionally eat. It's just that it's a disadvantage for you, because here's the way that I just ran a retreat and I just explained this to my group yesterday, that emotions, so our body has this amazing system of communicating with us about what its needs are. And this is why mindfulness is so valuable in learning how to break free of a diet approach. So as we learn to start listening to our body, we start noticing, oh, when my fuel levels are low, I start to feel hungry. I start to feel my stomach growling, my energy drops, I start getting irritable. Okay, good. Now I know what hunger feels like. Oh, I'm tired. Here I am trying to stay awake by eating more, but really I need to go to bed. I need rest. That's what I need. Or I'm working. I've been sitting in the same place for a really long time. I feel like getting some chocolate. I need to stand up. I need to get away from this computer. I need a break. I need a movement snack, not chocolate, right? So we begin to get really attuned to what our body's telling us. Well, emotions are also information. They're physical sensations that our body delivers to us through a complex neurochemical system that tries to tell us what our needs might be. And so, if we listen and become more attuned to noticing these physical sensations, that's why we call emotions feelings, right? If we start noticing what they are and learning how to name them, then we can become more clear about what our body is trying to tell us. So, a simple example, you used stress as an example. If I am feeling stressed, usually there's some physical sensations with that, a lot of thoughts that are going along with that. I could eat chocolate and probably feel better for a little while. And so I don't think that eating when I feel stressed is a bad thing or means that I'm a bad person or that I'm broken. It's just that the chocolate only helps for a little while. And then afterward, I'm still stressed. The stress is still there. And so the problem with emotional eating for most people is that it doesn't allow us to actually figure out how to meet our true needs. If, on the other hand, I say, okay, I'm stressed, I could eat if I wanted to. That's perfectly acceptable. I have a feeling that this is probably not a need for food right now. I'm not having any hunger symptoms. What's going on? Why do I feel stressed? What is the need here? And it could be anything from I have too much to do, I need help. People have high expectations of me. I have high expectations of myself. It could be any number of things. And if I can just pause for long enough to start to sort that out, then I have the opportunity to figure out how to meet that need even better. And then when I'm hungry, if I want chocolate still, great. Chocolate's going to meet my need for fuel too and pleasure. So it's not that chocolate is a bad thing to do when you feel stressed. It's just that it doesn't work very well for very long. So emotional eating can be a really important piece of this puzzle, even if you have binge eating, because if we can start to learn how to interpret our emotions, we can begin to take care of ourselves better. Now, some people who have emotions that are uncomfortable or they don't understand or they want to escape from might choose to eat a lot of food, go to the grocery store or multiple fast food restaurants and buy food to try to make those emotions calm down or to escape from them or numb them. And that might be what we would call binge eating. And if it happens on a regular basis, they might be diagnosed with actual binge eating disorder. So it's all on a spectrum. And the good news for you and I is that there's a lot we can do to help our clients heal from this and begin to have a healthy relationship with food where they can include chocolate and also can learn how to meet their other needs even better than chocolate ever could.
I agree with that. And I just thought about when you were talking about decoding the reasons why we use food as a coping mechanism. I thought about this acronym HALT, H-A-L-T. So trying to identify whether you're actually hungry or are you angry, or is there any emotion that is triggering that you're really thinking that you want to use food, whether you're tired or you just need to, you're just feeling bored and you want to use food as a way to kind of get away with it. So
That's interesting. Boredom is so funny. I'm glad you brought that up because in my work, and this may be true for you too, I find that stress and boredom are two of the most common triggers for overeating,
yes.
emotional eating, and binge eating, right? Which is so funny, Astrid, because as we talked about stress a moment ago, often it's because we have too much to do. And boredom is when we don't have enough to do. So somehow we've learned that food can kind of help us meet in the middle, right? Like it can help calm us down and pick us up. It can give us something to do. With boredom, eating works because eating is something to do, but it's one of about 10,000 options of things that we can do. And the problem is when you stop eating, you're bored again. So you go back and eat more. And so that's why, as we start to say, this is boredom, This is not hunger. This is boredom. I could eat. And that is so important. Don't turn mindful eating into a diet where you say, oh, if I'm not hungry, I can't eat. That's restriction too. And that will backfire also. It's more important to say, I'm hungry. I'm not hungry. Excuse me. I'm not hungry. I could eat. And I recognize that I'm bored. So let me find something to do for 10 or 15 minutes. And then I'll check back in and see how I'm feeling at that point and make another decision.
I agree with that so much. And I think there are even, like, I feel like there are even more reasons that sometimes people don't really think about when it comes to overeating and like creating this unhealthful relationship with food. Have you ever come across like other reasons why people binge eat, especially like when you think about overeating or losing control, or these people that tend to say, I fell off the wagon when the night comes, especially at night, people seem to lose their control, whether it is because their diet, their breakfast sucks because they're not having breakfast, they're skipping breakfast, or they are not having regular meal patterns, so they just kind of eating erratically every single day, or they just feel like they had so much to do, and then when they come home, they have nothing to do. It's completely opposite, and they feel anxious about that situation. What are some of the things that you have noticed in your groups that maybe are not as a common direct ways to or causes for people feeling like they lose control or they fall off the wagon when at night or things like that? But
Yes.
what is your experience with that?
Oh my gosh. I want to unpack that question because there's so many rich bits to this. So let me see. Let's start with even the term falling off the wagon. When I hear somebody use a phrase like that, when one of my clients says, oh, I fell off the wagon, or I blew it, or I was so bad, or I lost control, what that usually means is that they were trying to be in control, that there was some element of restriction. And it's really important to recognize that sometimes you're not even on a formal diet, but you're restricting because, or you're just sort of using diet rules that you've picked up along the way. Oh, I shouldn't eat that. Oh, I should skip breakfast because if I eat then and then I eat later, and then we get into this whole thing. And so the first thing I want to do is find out whether they are actually restricting or informally restricting in their thoughts and feeling guilty about the food they eat, because that is one of the very strong triggers for overeating in the evening is that idea. And let me talk for a minute about overeating. So I used that phrase very easily. I used it earlier, but let's be careful, because overeating means that there is some level of eating that is normal and acceptable. And if you eat more than that, you are overeating. And I don't mean it that way. I don't mean it as a judgment. I just mean that we eat to the point that we feel discomfort. Our body feels physically uncomfortable. In other words, I don't believe that, eating more food than your body needs means you're a bad person or you did a bad thing. I just mean that it feels bad. You feel physically bad. Okay. So backing up from that, if we're restricting during the day, then we are much more likely to want to eat more in the evening or binge eat or, eat emotionally. So that's one thing. Another thing is that, as you pointed out, you're busy all day and then you're, now all of a sudden it's like nothing to do or not anything you want to do, right? Like we don't want to clean the house or whatever. So this, by that time of day, the evening is what a lot of people experience as a high risk time for overeating. They're vulnerable at that time. They're tired potentially. Maybe they've been restricting throughout the day. Maybe they haven't practiced self-care throughout the day. They haven't fed themselves regularly when they were hungry. And so by the evening, now they're bored, maybe watching TV, maybe not wanting to clean the house or do the laundry or whatever they told themselves they would do. So they start procrastinating, right? Procrastinating. So I think for many people, the evening is a high risk time. So how do you unravel that? Well, it's really about backing up and trying to really understand what's driving it. So a diet or a restrictive rule might say, don't eat after 7 o'clock.
Mm.
Well, that's all fine and good as long as you're on that diet. But if you never really understand why you were wanting to eat after 7 in the first place, then when you go off that meal plan, you're going to go right back to eating after 7. Or what some people do is they try different diets where certain foods are allowed and certain foods aren't. They're still eating after 7, but they're eating the allowed foods, the ones that are acceptable on their diet. And so they've never really understood what was driving it. And they've never really repatterned and learned how to take care of themselves better in the evenings than eating does. So let's say it's boredom. I had a client, also a man. I had a client who found himself eating in front of the television a lot. And he realized through really considering what was going on that he and his wife used to sit and they would watch TV and they would eat together. And his wife had passed. And so he didn't have that companionship. So it wasn't just watching TV. He was bored. He was lonely. There was probably a little bit of maybe not clinical depression, but some depression going on there. And he figured out for himself that if he set up a card table with all of his stained glass supplies that he never used to be able to leave out because his wife would always make him put them away, he could just leave them out all the time and worked on his stained glass. Now he had something joyful to do while he watched TV. It helped his loneliness. It was eating incompatible. He couldn't eat at the same time. And it actually filled a need that eating would never have met for him. So it's the answer is different for every single person. And our job as coaches is not to tell people what to do, don't eat after 7, but to help them understand what's actually driving the behavior and then come up with solutions that actually meet the underlying need.
When you think about, or when you say about, talk about solutions to try to meet their needs, what are some of the solutions and some of the strategies that you implement with your clients? I generally, when I think about mindless eating or like dealing with cravings, so like it is probably not real hunger. I generally suggest my clients to identify what is triggering and what is causing that sensation to begin with, and try to identify whether it's real hunger to begin with. But if it's not real hunger, I generally suggest them to go for try to come up with like a list of at least 4 or 5 things that are generally activities that involve cognitive engagement and physical movement that allows them to kind of get away from that situation and help them kind of distract them and feel a little bit more relaxed, or just deviate from the situation of just trying to rely on food to cope. And once that, I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
No, I think that's a really wonderful question. So in Am I Hungry, we use, as you know, the mindful eating cycle as a decision-making tool. So we try to give people some structure because we're not giving them any rules about what they should eat. We're not telling them they can't eat this or this is a bad food, etc. And so they still benefit from structure because they're learning so many new skills. So what you're describing here is part of this decision where, okay, I feel like eating. So let's do it in a structured way. So I feel like eating. The first thing I do is pause and check in to notice what's happening right now. That's mindfulness, right? I notice whether I'm having any physical sensations of hunger, the growling, the empty stomach, the irritability, and so on. And as a coach, if they don't know what those are, or don't remember, or have forgotten, we work on that. That's an important first step. We also teach them how to pay attention to what thoughts and feelings they might be having at that time. So let's say that they say, okay, I feel like eating, I'm having some cravings, but I'm not hungry. There's no physical sensations that my body needs fuel right now. It's like checking your fuel gauge before you fill up your tank, right? So nope, my body doesn't need fuel. So what now? Well, there's 3 options. The first option is to eat anyway. And as I said before, it's exceedingly important that that's still an option. If you say to yourself, I'm not hungry, I'm not allowed to eat, you're back on some other diet and it's not going to work for you. So I think it's really important to say, I could eat if I wanted to. What happens is that then we take away the power and the associated guilt with that, and it loses the momentum that it gets when you eat and you think you shouldn't, and then you can't stop. Second option, if you decide, no, you know what, I want to eat, but I know I'm not hungry. What else could I do? Second option is to distract yourself until you get to, I take that back, redirect your attention until you get hungry. And the reason I pulled back the word distraction, that's what I said in my first book years ago, is that one of my clients said to me, well, when you say distract yourself, it kind of reminds me of like a little kid who's trying to do something and you try to distract him to stop him from doing it. And what we're really talking about here is just saying, I feel like eating. I know I'm not hungry. Let me turn my attention to something else and see if the urge to eat passes. So we're just redirecting our attention. That might be any number of things. It might be taking a walk or doing a load of laundry or surfing the internet. It could be anything. It has to be something that you want to do that is effective for you, that's enjoyable and brings your attention away. And if it's eating incompatible, even better, because who can do stained glass and eat at the same time, right? Third option is a more difficult option, but it's most effective. And that is to actually figure out what the need is and meet that need. So unlike randomly trying different things that might end up redirecting your attention, meeting your true needs is saying, okay, I have a craving. I'm not hungry. I could do something else, but actually I sense that there's something going on here. What is making me feel like eating right now? And then once I can figure out what that emotion is and what that emotion is trying to tell me that I need, then what small step could I take to meet that need? So let me give you an example to put it into real terms. Let's say that you have a client who is at work, super busy. Another high risk time for eating for some of us is middle of the afternoon. By then, we're kind of getting burned out. Our day has gone on and on. Maybe it's stressful. Things are piling on. There's not quite enough time to finish it all. And that might be a time you feel like eating. Well, you could go to the break room, see if somebody brought something to eat and have a snack. You could redirect your attention and, really zone in on getting your work done or go talk to a coworker or do something else. Or you could say, okay, what am I actually feeling right now? I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling bored. I'm feeling stressed. And what's causing it? Then I might say, you know what? I wish that I could just go on vacation. That's what I need. I need a vacation. Well, obviously, you're not going to leave your work in the middle of the afternoon to take a vacation, but you might give yourself 5 minutes to hop on a travel site and see about, upcoming possible trips or deals. You might call your partner and plan a day trip this weekend. You might put in a vacation request with your boss for a future vacation. You might do a vacation in your mind, do a little guided meditation in your mind and take yourself to a beach for a couple of minutes to relax your nervous system. So it's not that you're going to go on vacation right that minute, but you might be able to take some small step that's going to get you a little closer to what you need than eating ever could. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you're trying to find out these different options and navigate what is the best option for you. And knowing that you have options allows you to make the right choice. And I guess you're not always going to get it right for at first, because this is a learning journey that some days you're going to choose wrong, and you realize, well, now I know that I have to know better next time. And it is something that it is going to be challenging, and I think that's where a lot of people get frustrated and trying to be a little bit more gentle and compassionate with themselves, is because they find that they fail once and it's like, I'm broken, I just completely unable to change this. But it's trying to accept that it takes time, practice, and it's something that it is going to always be like a roller coaster. Some days are going to be very good and some other days not so good. And I think a lot of that success might come with practice, patience, and I think as well, giving yourself a little bit of credit when you do things right. Celebrate these small wins that sometimes they don't feel like are worth it, but they actually do matter.
Yeah, I'm like, because I want to jump in and say that one of the traps that diet culture has taught us is in thinking in terms of right and wrong and good and bad and success and failure. So for many of the people that I work with, I find that it's really helpful to start to catch those words and say, because with mindful eating, you can never do it wrong. If you notice that you made a decision that it's ineffective for you, you feel uncomfortable when you're done eating, or you feel tired, or something happens, you didn't screw it up. You just learned something. And you didn't fail. You just added to your knowledge base of how to work with your own body and your own triggers. So eliminating this idea that there are right ways and wrong ways and good ways and bad ways to do it really, really goes a long way to helping people see that there's a middle. And I think that's the other thing that I wanted to say earlier about your question about the evening eating and the loss of control. And that is that in diet culture, in the old way of doing this that you and I were brought up in, both as women, but also as health professionals, we were sort of taught that, that you're either in control of your eating or you're out of control. You're on the wagon, you're off the wagon. You're on the diet, you're off the diet. And those extremes in thinking, psychologists call it dichotomous thinking, or these kind of polar opposites. What mindfulness does for the people that I work with is it teaches them that between in control and out of control is a middle where you are in charge. So you are always in charge. You are always making decisions for yourself. Sometimes those decisions might be, I'm going to eat the cookies. Sometimes they might be, nah, I'm not eating cookies right now. That's not out of control and in control. That is, I'm in charge. I am making decisions when I want. And when I make a decision that doesn't work for me, instead of feeling guilty, I might regret that choice. I might say, oh, I really wish I hadn't done that. Why did it happen? What would I do differently if I could do it over again? Or what would I do differently next time? Now I've turned every single experience into a learning opportunity, into a way of learning more and more about how to take care of myself. And I think that this is such an important process because, as you said, it's not a one-time deal. It's truly a journey, and it's never done. I mean, to this day, doing this work for more than 20 years, to this day, I make mistakes myself, and I go, oh, why did I do that? Or, whoa, I wish that hadn't happened. But I don't feel bad about it. I didn't blow it, and I don't then have to finish it all and go back on my diet tomorrow.
And
There will never be.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, that mindset. And I think that's what I teach the most to my clients and advocate to, that reflective thinking and being able to identify what was wrong, or not wrong. I actually don't like that word. I like to say, what do you think were there are any opportunities that you think you could do better? Is there anything that you might have found that you could have done something different? And do bring up that skill of reflective thinking and self-awareness, interoceptive awareness. What is going on? How do I feel? Why do I feel this way? What did I do that maybe wasn't the right choice? And this kind of thinking is so important to bring it up all the time. And the more you practice this skill of being reflective and understand, not just kind of be very emotional and irrational about certain things and like, I just screw up, I just going to quit because it's all lost. Now, no, it is not like that. It's actually taking back, collecting your thoughts and analyzing what did I do, what was happening, what was I feeling, thinking, and maybe bring some takeaways from it. What are some learnings opportunities from this situation, and put it on top of your skill and is an option list for next time this situation comes up. What can you do better?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's something that people understandably need help with, because it's not something that comes intuitively. It's not something that they may have learned. And certainly, as I said before, diet culture teaches us exactly the opposite. It teaches us we were good or we were bad or we blew it or we didn't. And ultimately, that thinking is so flawed and unhelpful, but it's really challenging for people to see. And I don't know if you've seen this with the people you work with, but it can be kind of scary to give up all those rules, because people have learned that learn to think that if they don't have the rules, then they'll blow it. What they don't realize is the rules themselves actually drove them to have the cravings and the deprivation and then the overeating and then the guilt. And they didn't realize that the whole cycle is broken first by stepping away and saying, I don't need these rules. I just need to become more aware of the decisions that I'm making and why, and some guidance to help me do that.
I agree. And something I really love about your work and your book is that you teach a lot mindful eating. But I wonder if you can explain a little bit more in depth what mindful eating is and how do we actually mindfully eat?
Yeah, so mindful eating, I think a simple definition is eating with intention and attention,
Mhm.
which is purpose and awareness. So it is having a purpose for eating, whether it is to fuel and nourish your body, to bring pleasure to your meal, and so on. And then attention is really about eating with the awareness that it takes to notice what's happening in your body, to notice the food and whether you're enjoying it and how it's affecting you. So that intention and attention can be transformative in somebody who in the past was eating fairly unconsciously, eating quickly, putting food in their mouth and then loading their next forkful instead of tasting the forkful they had, or eating in front of the TV, or eating while we're scrolling through our social media feeds. I mean, there's a lot of ways that people eat mindlessly. Now, what I will say is that our approach at Am I Hungry is that mindful eating is the entire decision-making process, beginning with all the things you and I've been talking about, which is why are you eating in the first place? When do you feel like eating? What do you choose to eat? How do you eat it physically? How does the food get into your body? How much of it do you eat? And then where do you use the energy that you've consumed? So that's the mindful eating cycle that I mentioned before. Why, when, what, how much, and where. Sometimes, because mindful eating has become kind of popularized, sometimes you're going to see people out in social media and other places that are using mindful eating like a diet. And so I would be very careful. And some hints that you'll see is people will say things like, chew each bite 32 times, never eat in front of the television, things that are very prescriptive instead of it being about purpose and awareness. So I just encourage people to really look at mindful eating through the lens of how can eating support the life I want to live, rather than making eating into this huge focus of your day and your life all the time, because people are spending way too much attention on their eating. And I think we need to bring that back into proportion, bring it back into scale so that we're using it in a way that's truly benefiting us instead of us being in service to the diet.
Oh, yes. I think that is such a wonderful answer. And I love that you use these cycles to kind of create a structure and a thinking pattern and kind of draw your attention to what is causing or what are some of the ways that you can approach your response. And I think I've seen as well an instinctive eating cycle that you have mentioned in your book. Is that the same as intuitive eating, like being eating intuitively, or do you find that it's a little bit of a different terminology between these two?
No, I think there's a lot of overlap, a tremendous amount of overlap in what we teach and intuitive eating. I think the difference is more about how we teach it. So the instinctive eating cycle is it's so the mindful eating cycle is the cycle that we use to help us identify patterns. And so the mindful eating cycle can help us identify patterns of instinctive eating, which is your natural driver for eating. It's the way that we were all born to cry when we were hungry and stop when we were full and eat what we love, but not spend all of our time and energy thinking about food in between, right? That's instinctive eating. We can also look at patterns of overeating, which you and I have talked about, and we can look at patterns of binge eating. We can also look at the patterns that happen in the mindful eating cycle when somebody's restricting. And so the mindful eating cycle makes it possible for us to, as clinicians, to recognize patterns of behaviors, but also for people that we're working with to start to learn how to identify what's happening in any given moment. So intuitive eating is more of, I would say intuitive eating compares better to mindful eating than instinctive eating, because instinctive eating is just one style of eating that we can identify in the eating cycle. I know that's pretty complex. We cover it in our health professional training because it is a good question. But I think if people have heard of intuitive eating, you can feel very safe that our approach to mindful eating falls very closely in alignment with that.
I think I saw something that I really, really love about an approach to binge eating. And I think you mentioned to have an approach of inside out and giving voices to some of these things that are going on in your head, like binge voice, restrictive voice, self-care voice, and name these personalities. Tell me a little bit about that. And I know I've got you a little bit over time, but if you want, we can just cover this question and we can wrap up with this one. But this one
Sure.
also
Well, I
good.
want to give credit to Dr. Carrie Anderson. So I mentioned earlier the Mindful Eating for Binge Eating program and Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat for Binge Eating book. So Carrie Anderson is my co-author and co-developer of that program. And I really need to give her credit for this because she's been working in the eating disorder field for more than 30 years and super experienced and comes with her own personal history of binge eating disorder. And so she's an amazing person. And so she's the one who developed that particular exercise that we train therapists to use who do our mindful eating for binge eating training. And so the essence of it is that a lot of times, as we've been talking about, we have these subconscious or thought patterns that we don't even recognize. We don't notice that they're there. And so one of the things that this particular exercise can do is it can help us start to recognize these little voices in our head that are driving certain behaviors. So as you mentioned, maybe you have a binge voice who says, it would be really fun to stop and get a cake on our way home from work. No one's going to be at home tonight. We can eat it. Then you go, oh, I hear you. You're my binge voice. And you might have the opposite voice who's saying, you can't eat cake. Cake is bad for you. You're going to lose control. You're such a loser, right? Like you can actually hear these voices when you take a step back, which is what mindfulness is, right? It's about stepping back from the thoughts so you can actually notice what's happening. So in this activity, especially if you're working with a therapist to help you with binge eating disorder, you can name your binge voice. You can give it a personality. You might draw it. Your restrictive voice might look a different way, have a different sound in her voice, have a different name. I mean, it's amazing the creative things that I've heard people come up with during our retreats to help really identify their binge eating and their restrictive voices. Just a quick example, we had one person who brought in a recording. There's a cartoon show, and she brought in a recording from YouTube, and it's mommy, 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 mommy. And she's like, that's what my binge voice sounds like. It's like, hey, eat, let's eat. It was perfect because now when it starts happening, she can smile and go, I recognize you, instead of reacting mindlessly to whatever's happening in her brain that she's not noticing.
Oh, I love that. And what about the self-care voice? We didn't mention that much about it. What does that one have to do, and how do we train it? Because I think that's the powerful one.
It absolutely is. And so that's the point of the activity, is that once you can start to recognize your binge voice and your restrictive voice, you can begin to cultivate the self-care voice. So that self-care voice is the one that wants the best for you. It's the voice that really wants to take care of you, or you to take care of it or yourself. And so that self-care voice might say, hey, I know you feel like having cake. If you buy a whole entire cake and eat it, you are going to feel so miserable tonight. And tomorrow we were planning to go to the zoo with your sister. Look, cake is fine. Why don't we stop and buy a slice instead? Let's sit down, have a candlelight slice of cake on a beautiful plate, enjoy it, treat ourselves. And then what do you think about a hot bath afterward? Would that be nice? Like, the self-care voice is going to offer you alternatives between have it all, don't have any of it, and really begin to start to take better care of yourself. So learning to cultivate and recognize a self-care voice is really important. And to go back to the work that you and I do, part of what might happen is for a while, they might need to borrow our self-care voices. They might need to hear, they might think to themselves, well, what would Michelle say? What would Astrid say? What would she suggest to me in this moment? And they can borrow our self-care voices until they have their own, which is ultimately what we want, is for them not to need us, but for them to go on and live their life and have all the skills and tools that they need to really live that vibrant life they've been craving.
Oh, I love that. I absolutely love that approach. And giving voices, I think it is such a practical example to, and like it's not just practical, but it's also visual. You can identify it, see it, hear it, and just put it into practice in a much more easier way. I think that is such a
Compassionate way,
powerful,
right?
yes. Oh, I
Mhm.
love that. So I can't just thank you enough for being here today and spend this time with me. I really appreciate your work. I do value it a lot, and I think this conversation has been so nourishing, and I'm so grateful for it. Tell me a little bit about your future projects. Anything coming up? How can people find you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's been my pleasure to talk with you and your listeners as well, Astrid. I think the simplest way for people to start to learn more about this is to go to our website, which is amihungry.com. That's amihungry.com. And on that very front page, you're going to find links to get you to free resources. You can download the first chapter of Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat, where I explain the mindful eating cycle and instinctive eating and restrictive eating and overeating. And that will be a good starting place, because that book, that first chapter, will let you know whether this is something that makes sense for you. I also would suggest, if some of the work that we've been talking about in terms of binge eating seems to resonate, then I would dig a little deeper into that website, because in the store, for example, which is just a link on the top, you'll find our Mindful Eating for Binge Eating program, the workbook and the book that you can get. And I think that would be a good first step. If you think you might have binge eating disorder, you can take the binge eating scale on our website also, to really begin to heal your relationship with food, so that you can start to have more space in your life to practice good self-care.
Michelle, I'm so thankful and grateful for your presence here today and having a chat with me. I hope you had a good time, and you had some questions that probably you don't hear as much, especially coming with from someone who is in the middle of like a complicated situation. Because I really pro to and advocate for that holistic approach and really healing relationship with food, mindful eating. Um, but I'm in the fitness industry, so it is a very challenging environment, and it is a long road and a long battle to fight. But yes, I think it is such an amazing way to wrap this podcast today. And I think it is such a wonderful that you're doing this work out there and teaching and empowering much more people to do the same. So I appreciate you, and I hope to see you very soon.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Emotional eating can be a really important piece of this puzzle, even if you have binge eating, because if we can start to learn how to interpret our emotions, we can begin to take care of ourselves better.